I want to be very clear that we are firm in our resolve that these cuts are firmly and unequivocally rejected. The unilateral termination of agreements between the Commonwealth and the states is completely unacceptable, and that is what has happened. We have resolved today that there needs to be an urgent meeting of COAG before the 1st of July this year, because we need to, on behalf of Australians, sort this out. And I assure everyone who's watching that that is what we want to do. We want to sort this out. Just to amplify where we're coming from here, if I break it up, that contrary to what the Prime Minister has said today, there are immediate funding impacts to frontline services, and they kick in from the 1st of July this year. They are not years away or 3 years away. They commence this upcoming financial year, and we're prepared to provide quite a few examples of that. We, of course, reject the $80 billion cut to the ongoing and appropriate funding of hospitals and schools across the nation, and particularly point to the need for proper long-term funding streams to provide the necessary services that Australians pay their taxes right now for and quite rightfully expect. We then, of course, believe that in the longer term, it is the important white papers being undertaken on the Federation that must address the longer term issues, and we're calling for those white papers to be accelerated. So that's the overview. I might now just throw to Mike and in turn we'll talk about some of the issues and amplify on what we've said. So over to you.
Thanks, Campbell. I mean, in simple terms, the cuts that have been put forward by the federal government, we cannot absorb. We can give no clearer message to Canberra than to say we cannot absorb these cuts. The cuts have an immediate impact, and we've seen that in health. In terms of the funding in health, what we're seeing over the next 12 months, hundreds and hundreds of hospital beds here in New South Wales alone, over 1,000 nationally, impacted by the decisions in relation to health, and this cannot proceed. The states have taken actions to ensure they're delivering services as efficiently as possible. We've done that in New South Wales. But the impacts we are seeing from these cuts hit and take away from the people of this state, indeed every state and territory, frontline services, including across our hospitals, that's going to have a massive impact in day-to-day delivery of those services. The budget problem, as we have said collectively, cannot be outsourced to the states. We can't afford it. It's a pretty simple equation. We cannot afford the problems that have been handed to us from Canberra. The future expectation was that the Commonwealth Government will be participating or absorbing about 40% of funding for hospitals across the country. If you look at the projections, that's being slashed to 14%. Asking the states to pick up that shortfall is something they cannot do, which is why, again, we have come together today and we have called on Canberra, the Prime Minister, to convene an urgent COAG that addresses the matters of federation, these budget cuts as an urgent priority for every person here, not only in New South Wales, but every person across the country. I'll hand across to Denis.
Thank you very much. The Prime Minister this morning on Melbourne radio said it's not that they are losing money tomorrow or next week or next month or even next year. Clearly our advice as Premiers and First Ministers is that there will be impacts as of 1st of July. Impacts in health funding, impacts in reductions in funding for concessions from Canberra. So we firmly believe there will be impacts from 1st of July this year. So given that apparent confusion between what the Prime Minister has said and what we are absolutely convinced is happening in our own states and territories, it highlights the absolute imperative for an urgent COAG meeting to sort these matters out. We need to sort out what is happening from the 1st of July, because my belief as Premier of Victoria is that Victoria will lose about $200 million in funding as of 1st of July through national partnerships being discontinued, through the reduction in funding for concessions, and this will have a direct impact on Victoria. So we need to sort that out. Then, of course, we need to address the potential impacts of the medium-term decisions, such as the co-payment for GP services on our emergency departments and our health system that we deliver at state and territory level. And, of course, we need to address the fundamental concern we all have about the proposed $80 billion in cuts in health and education into the future. These are simply unaffordable, unsustainable as far as the states are concerned, and those people who will be directly affected are ordinary Australian families. The Victorian government is putting more money into health, putting more money into education. We want that money to be spent on treating more people at our hospitals, providing a better education for our children. We don't want that undermined by a reduction in funding at a federal level. So there is obvious confusion about the immediate, and we need that sorted out with a COAG meeting, and we need to have a better arrangement between Canberra and the states and territories in the long term to ensure that all Australians get the education system and the health system they need and deserve.
Jay.
Thank you. 6,000 South Australians attended a rally in Adelaide today against these cuts. They wanted me to come here to this national meeting of premiers and chief ministers to reach an agreement to resist these cuts, and that's what we've done today. Each of us have committed to one simple proposition, that's to say no to these cuts. Reject them entirely. What the Commonwealth did the other day in the budget is that they decided to push something across the table to us, or we're pushing it right back to them. Start again, meet with us, commit to the process you agreed to just a few short weeks ago when we all sat around the table at the COAG meeting and said that we would discuss the future of federation. Abide by your agreements. Engage in a mature, constructive discussion about the future of our nation. And that's what we've committed ourselves to doing today. The Prime Minister today has said something which is just simply incorrect. He said that these changes don't come in for a number of years. We know in South Australia from year one, in other words in 43 days' time, that we will have to close the equivalent of 150 beds as a consequence of these cuts. That's equivalent to one of our hospitals, the Noarlunga Hospital. Over a period of time, over the forward estimates, over the next 3 years, that ramps up to 600 beds, the equivalent of the Flinders Medical Centre, one of our large teaching hospitals in South Australia. And that's just the health cuts. Over the life of the agreement in relation to education, we will lose the equivalent of 3,000 teachers that would otherwise be in the system. And what does this mean for people? Why are 6,000 South Australians raising their voices in Adelaide today? They understand that this is about making sure that when they are sick, there is a hospital bed for them. When their children has a learning difficulty, there is the extra teaching support to allow their child to be a success. That's what's at stake, that's what's motivating them, and we're speaking for those Australians as we stand here today together. We've not seen rallies like this in South Australia since Work Choices, and I think it's fair to say that Tony Abbott and the federal Liberal government have united the nation against these cuts. They've even managed to unite a group of chief ministers and premiers against these cuts. And I think it's absolutely important that we remain united, that we are steadfast in our resistance to these cuts, but we commit ourselves to the process that we committed ourselves just a few short weeks ago.
Adam.
Thanks, Campbell. Campbell, thanks very much for calling this meeting, and Mike, thanks very much for hosting it. There's no doubt that Australians have got to do heavy lifting in undertaking the repair work to fix the state of the federal budget, both in an aspect of debt and deficit. But some of the cuts that have been announced to date just a few short weeks after a COAG meeting, clearly weren't on the agenda at that COAG meeting and weren't displayed in the active components of cooperative federalism. So I think it's important that we've come together for the CAF meeting today. As Jay said, in just 43 days, Australians are being asked to accept a reduction in health funding of some 1,200 equivalent hospital beds around the nation. In the Northern Territory, that represents 10 beds. It represents about $650 million over both the forward estimates and the outer years. Around $300 million in education over the forward estimates and the outer years. What's being described in the repair work for this budget is more so around outer years, and some of the Prime Minister's comments today seem to reflect that there is not going to be any change from the 1st of July. Well, clearly that's not true. There is a reduction for all of us over the forward estimates, and that's going to impact our budgets. Some of us have already put our budgets out, some of us are about to put our budgets out. I think it's important that we have openness, honesty and transparency when we're dealing in a model of cooperative federalism. We've spoke a little bit about health and education. I think that they're the headline factors, but let's not underestimate the impact on pensioners and the cuts to pensioners, what it's going to mean for Indigenous affairs, particularly in the Northern Territory where some of the most disadvantaged people in our country live, and the impacts on both health and education. Those people will see those effects, but also on the impacts of housing, what it means for NRAS, what it means for affordability, and how some of those people will receive services. The other component about this is what's going to happen with the immediate cancellation or the foreseen cancellation of some of the national partnership agreements that we've signed up with honesty and integrity, and how the early termination of those agreements will have a negative impact on both service delivery, the cost of services for each jurisdiction, particularly the Northern Territory, and how that will impact people's lives through the cost of living. So thanks, Campbell, for calling this meeting.
Thanks, Campbell. I came to Sydney today on this Sunday to work constructively with my colleagues to understand the true extent, the ramifications of this federal budget, how it might obviously affect my magnificent, beautiful state of Tasmania, but also to understand how it's impacting on the other states and territories. When the budget was released, we described it as the good, the bad and the ugly. It's getting uglier by the day. And what we are seeing is something that is untenable, that is unsustainable, and I will not allow the rug to be pulled out from underneath us. I understand the extent of the budget crisis that the coalition government in Canberra has inherited. My government has inherited a similar thing in Tasmania, so I understand how important it is to get budgets back on track and to ensure that there is fiscal sustainability. And we're committed to delivering that in Tasmania. But I'm equally committed to ensuring that Tasmanians have good access to healthcare, access to good education, a fair allocation of Commonwealth funds to our states, and to ensure that Tasmania is not in any way disadvantaged by unilateral decisions that have been made in Canberra. So together we combine to not only understand the extent of the challenges we face, but also to send a very clear message that the conversation needs to start, and it needs to start now. We don't have 3 years to have this conversation. If these cuts go through as is proposed in Tasmania, it will mean $27 million coming out of our health budget this coming year. That's 59 hospital beds or over 5,000 surgical operations. That will not happen, and Tasmanians will be the poorer for that. And that's because what was previously agreed to, a no worse off guarantee that was previously part of the arrangement between my state and the Commonwealth, no longer exists. So the conversation needs to happen. It needs to happen soon, and I'm pleased to be with my colleagues today to extend not only the invitation to have that conversation over the coming weeks, but to say that it is absolutely critical to ensure that not only do we attend to the most critical task of fixing difficult budgetary circumstances, but we in no way disadvantage Tasmanians and Australians in the process.
Thanks, Will. Kate.
Thanks, Campbell, and yeah, thanks for the opportunity to meet today. I think it's been good to hear the impacts of the cuts on all jurisdictions around the country. I mean, Canberra got savaged last Tuesday night. That's not Canberra federal Parliament Canberra, but Canberra the city, the community got savaged. We lost 6,500 jobs, 2,000 to go in the next 12 months. So putting those job cuts aside, the impacts of the federal budget decisions, which were unilaterally imposed on all of us to cut a whole range of services, today we unite to reject those cuts. These cuts will impact on real people. That's been clear from all the discussions we've had today. It's not just numbers on a page in Budget Paper 3. These cuts will impact on the most vulnerable people. In Canberra, it'll be older people waiting in hospital for a nursing home bed. It'll be Indigenous kids attending early childhood school, and it'll be our pensioners with their changes to concessions. There's no doubt there's been a problem that's been created, and we've gathered to talk about that problem today. And I think in terms of Australians, they expect us to resolve this problem, and that's why we need this COAG meeting, and we need it before July when these cuts first start to bite.
Thanks, Katie. Now, look, ladies and gentlemen, we'll take questions in a moment, but I just might very quickly give you some direct examples, some very sort of almost personal examples of how the cuts start on the 1st of July. And this is the sort of stuff that has to be resolved. So, for example, there was a national partnership on preventive health, and we all received letters saying that that had been terminated. Now, this was an agreement signed in good faith only a few years ago that had a couple of years to run. So, for example, the Diabetic Association Queensland Division, the National Heart Foundation, Queensland University of Technology, the Queensland Association of Tuck Shops, the Playgroup Association of Queensland, all are expecting to receive funding for the next 1 to 2 years. That funding from the Commonwealth is not forthcoming. You just heard Katie mention pensioner concessions. My state gives out about $480 million this coming financial year. It's expected in pensioner concessions. The federal government providing about 10% of that, $48 million. So that impacts on concessions being paid to seniors and concession card holders for electricity, rates, water, natural gas, motor vehicle registration, public transport. There's also been a slashing of a program that provided concessions between the states when seniors or pensioners visited. I note the change to NRAS, which in Queensland, I know there's been stories to the contrary, but in Queensland, NRAS has been a very important program in providing housing stock to the less well-off. We've got a letter that came to myself from the aged care sector. There's a thing called the Aged Care Payroll Tax Supplement, which is worth about $630 million over the next 4 years. That's gone. And immediately the sector are coming to us asking for concessions on payroll tax. Otherwise, that will put costs on their operations of dealing with people in nursing homes. Local governments in Queensland are losing $930 million in the next 3 years because the federal financial assistance grants are being frozen instead of being indexed up. That puts pressure on every single one of the councils in Queensland. And I know the mayors and councils will then be left with the holding the baby, essentially, of having to put rates up. And the final point is that across the nation, we believe that it's equivalent to about 1,200 subacute beds being cut. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's the broad overview. Thank you for indulging every First Minister and saying a few words. I know it's been a long intro. Now over to you for some questions.
Was there any specific discussion on where extra revenue might come from? I'm talking about GST or the idea of income tax cuts.
Well, I made it very clear when I walked in the door today, this was not a conversation today about increasing taxes. This is about the fair share of the current taxes that are paid by Australians in all jurisdictions coming back to pay for the services that they expect and that they deserve. You know, I have a belief, and I think it's shared by the First Ministers, that the federal government want us to talk about tax increases. Sorry, we're not going there. In my state, we have done a lot of work cutting out inefficiency and waste and bureaucracy, and we didn't have to put pressure on people's cost of living by putting up taxes on families. I think the federal government should look at their own inefficiencies, waste and bureaucracy for cuts before they go after tax increases. And so simply they are passing $80 billion of problem to the states.
You've obviously all been blindsided, so what do you think you can say to the Prime Minister to get him back on board with...
I might ask Jay to answer that one.
No. We're all standing here saying no. And we're standing together, and what we will do is we'll be campaigning around this. I mean, we have a Senate. Its traditional function is the State's House. We'll be asking them to accept their responsibilities as protectors of those traditional responsibilities. So that will be an early source of campaigning for us. But I think what we're seeing in Adelaide and around the nation is ordinary men and women standing up and also saying no. And I think that those voices, if they're loud enough and they're consistent enough and they're sustained for long enough, will get through to the heads of the federal politicians. I mean, to give you an example, remember when Christopher Pyne went out and decided that he'd try and persuade us all that black was white and that the Gonski thing wasn't actually committed to in the election. And we put a lot of political pressure on him and the Prime Minister, and then all of a sudden they folded. Well, we're going to be doing the same thing again. We don't accept this. It's unacceptable, and we're going to campaign against it.
Isn't your message undermined by the fact that we don't have budgets next month? What is it, back to the drawing board? What do you do?
Well, it's not. I mean, it's not back to the drawing board. I mean, there's a lot of work that's gone into the budget to this point. What this does is it severely impacts our forward estimates. So we've heard the story today on the concept that's been pushed that, listen, this only happens in the longer term. Well, it's close to $2 billion impact over our forward estimates. That is money that's going directly into frontline services. We've heard that on health. There's hundreds of beds in our health system that are supported by that funding, and it's gone. So we will obviously, as we've done here today, we say to the Prime Minister and Federal Treasurer, there can't be a greater priority than coming back to the table with everyone here and say, how are we going to fix this mess? Because it is a mess. You know, we are in a mess because what happened in the budget allocated a huge problem and it was handed to the states to deal with. Well, we don't have the capacity to deal with it. And that's the point. So we need to come to Canberra as a matter of urgency. In relation to our budget, we have to march forward, and we will do exactly that. But I want to be clear, the impact day to day on our budget over the next 4 years is close to $2 billion, and that's impacting frontline services.
Premier Newman, given that there was a Premier discussed, and given that this budget has taken agreements that your governments drew up with Canberra and unilaterally, your word, thrown them out, can you sit here today and say you trust Tony Abbott? And if your answer is anything short of no, I'd be interested on how you manage it.
Well, look, I've been a good friend and supporter of Tony Abbott, and I continue to be so. And I'm confident that when these things are placed in front of him, that he will get the message that we've all given him today, that we need to have a good look at this, that the termination of national partnership agreements actually has perhaps a greater meaning than he's been advised. And it means that unilaterally, yes, they have said we're not going to honour something that was signed in good faith. I mean, from my own perspective, I can deal with a national partnership that is coming to its end. You know, there's no certainty there, and that's one of the problems with these national partnerships. But I think what gets up everyone's nose here is when an agreement was signed in good faith that it's been ripped up, and that can't be allowed to continue.
That's not a trustworthy act, is it?
Well, I'm very disappointed in it, and I'll say that. But I guess I'm looking to see what he understands of those agreements, because I'm prepared to give him the benefit of the doubt.
Isn't the Commonwealth's objective clear? They want to get out of public education and public health.
Well, that's fine, Quentin, it's fine for them to say they want to get out of that. And I have said in recent days, very happy to take on board the responsibility. But, for example, let's have a look at the numbers. $12.3 billion annual Queensland health budget. We've done a lot of work in the last 2 years to get it performing far better. The stats speak for themselves. About $3 billion is provided by the Commonwealth. But that $3 billion arguably has been taken out of the pockets of men and women, families of bread earners in Queensland. It's taken out of their pockets by their employers in the ATO. It goes to Canberra, goes through the Mixmaster. thousands of federal public servants in a health bureaucracy, and what are they there for now? And get sent back to us with conditions attached. We want to be grown-up governments. There's a very grown-up attitude today to trying to solve these problems. We need ultimately access to the revenue streams. But that's for another day. That is what the white paper exercise is about.
Access to the revenue stream, which
Yeah.
changes the nature of the federation.
Yeah. Well, I think we've got to today kind of deal with the problem. The problem is the way that they've done this and that they seem to assume there isn't an impact. There's a huge impact. We're stating the case there. We need to have the COAG meeting, and then what we need to do is get on with these white papers and remake our federation, turn this into a federation that works, that doesn't have the overlap and waste and inefficiency like we have today.
Isn't your message today undermined by the decision by the WA Premier not to attend to boycott the meeting?
Well, I'll just say Colin, we all know and love Colin, and Colin has a very strong and clear view about what he wants for WA. Our understanding in conversations that have had between the staff prior to the meeting today is that he broadly supports the thrust of this. He has a slightly different view about the timeframes involved, and maybe that's because the budget impacts aren't as pressing for him. You know, WA has been in a good financial position. In the last few years, it's deteriorated a bit more recently, but they have had quite a good run with the resources boom and royalties. So, you know, he will have to answer for himself and his views, but very clearly, ultimately, getting this federation to work properly is in the interests of all people of WA. I know at the end of the day he will support that.
I don't think you can get a stronger message. I don't think you can get a stronger message than who you see here at the table in the time frame we've done on a Sunday afternoon. There is a united voice that is saying we're standing up against this, and I don't think it can get stronger.
What do you want all your constituents to do? For Jay Weatherill?
Oh, that's easy. I would like, well, Quentin, that's easy. What I'd like is for men and women across Queensland to pick up the phone tomorrow morning, send an email, ring your local LNP member or senator, and let them know that you're concerned about this, and ask them to have a really good look at what is going on in the budget. That's what we'd like, and we'd all like that to happen. And
coming from an LNP Premier.
well,
Ring my party and give them an ear.
well, can I tell you this? I've been ringing and giving a few people an earful because that's how serious it is. And I can tell you that there are some federal members and senators from my state that are taking what I'm saying extremely seriously. I'm not going to tell you who they are today, but I'm sure they're out there.
How strong is this bond here today? Is it one in all in until you get the result you want? How strong is this bond?
I think on the issue, it's very strong, and I think you can see that today by the way people are responding.
It's extremely strong because we understand the direct impacts these decisions have on services and ordinary families in our jurisdictions. As of 1st of July, these will have impacts in Victoria. They'll have impacts on Victorian families, and the longer term impacts will even be more potentially severe. And in answer to the question over here before, I think the message we say is let's have the discussions first and then the decisions about the financial arrangements. What we've had in this situation, we've had decisions on financial arrangements and then say, I hope this forces you into some discussions about the future of the Federation. That's not the mature and correct way to go about it.
Did Tony Abbott lose the plot when he delivered this, when Joe Hockey delivered this budget? I mean, look at you all standing here, sitting here today.
I think that Tony Abbott needs to come to a COAG meeting with us to hear firsthand the direct impact, because when Tony Abbott's making comments on the media today that there won't be any immediate impacts, there won't be impacts for a number of years on states and territories, that is contrary to the advice we're getting from all our advisors and all our bureaucrats who are telling us there will be immediate impacts as of the 1st of July and significant impacts. And I think that's the message we would say to Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey, that their advice needs to be updated by a sit-down with the leaders of the states and territories where they can hear firsthand of the immediate impacts, of the medium-term impacts and the significant potential long-term impacts on our health system, our education system and, of course, on the structure of the finances at state and territory level.
Ladies and gentlemen, we need to start to wind this up, so I think we'll take 3 more questions. Yeah. How about you, Tom? You haven't had a go yet.
Can I just ask, you said today that you have sympathy for Tony Abbott trying to balance the budget. You've also been very firm on the GST. Now, given any decisions the federal government makes will affect Queensland voters, how would you have them raise revenue or make cuts if it's not going to be in this area and it's not going to be the GST?
That's quite straightforward, Tom. Again, I go back to what I said earlier on. I came to office and inherited a mess. We worked hard to actually find savings, to cut waste and bureaucracy, and we've now achieved a situation where we've got an extra $1 billion a year in the health budget. Our emergency departments are performing better than they ever have before. Our elective surgery waiting times, and I'll probably get howled down here, we're told by the AMA are the best in the nation now. So we've made the change. See, I knew that I'd get them going. There it is, the end of unanimity. We've made the changes and we've made the tough decisions, and we're getting the result. But we didn't put taxes and charges up in a way that affected the cost of living of Queenslanders. We didn't do that, nor did we throw a burden onto local government and say, you sort it out. That's what's going on here. They need to find the savings. They need to deal with their issues internally and not pass a burden onto the states and to then men and women across the states and territories. It's there for their taking. Look, the federal budget is $400 billion a year. Only 2% saving on that $400 billion over the 10 years of these $80 billion worth of cuts equals $80 billion. 2% efficiency in the federal budget leads to no need to put $80 billion worth of cuts on the states. Second last question. Over here.
Yeah, well, I mean, the impacts, I mean, as I said, Anna, over in the health sector, it's over $1.2 billion. And that's national partnership arrangements that are directly going into frontline services. So it's equivalent to beds that are impacting us. We have some in education, obviously, predominantly in the outer year of the estimates in relation to the Gonski arrangements. That's the main. And then there's the concessions. So that we heard about the rebates that come into pensioners in waters, rates and electricity bills, and that is a big cost that goes up to about $100 million a year. So in New South Wales, it's close to $2 billion over the forward estimates, and that's why we are all here today. I mean, it's one thing to say that these are problems that need to be addressed in the longer term, and if there are problems in the longer term that need to be addressed, well, let's do that collaboratively. Let's do that constructively. Let's not bring down a budget that says, by the way, the money's gone. Good luck with that. So that's the main aim. But there's also an impact in the short term. And our budgets are going to have to deal with that. We're going to have to make decisions around our budgets, and the impact is at the front line. And as Campbell said, I mean, there's a range of things that we've done here in New South Wales. We had expenditure that was up over 7%. We've contracted that down to just under 3%. We've tried to be as efficient as we possibly can. You're getting down to the position when you take away that money, it is taking away from the front line.
Last question.
We still haven't heard any ideas on how more revenue can be delivered to the state short of Canberra rewriting big parts of their budget. Can we get some ideas?
I think I've been very firm. I'll have to say it again. There's enough pressure on the cost of living of families across this nation to start talking about tax increases today, and we're ruling that out. I mean, you know, when we hear about a $7 payment to go to see the doctor, in my own electorate, which is a reasonably well-off electorate in the inner northwest of Brisbane, I know that at one of my local community groups, it's called Pick a Bean, they don't have enough to keep the shelves full of food they're giving out to pensioners at the moment. So $7 is a big deal. We're not proposing that they be hit through increases to other taxes right now, like the consumption tax, the GST. The problem needs to start with a firm resolution to go after the costs of government, and the federal government need to go after their costs rather than try and shift on to the states. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming today.